The Crown ended on a high note for me personally. I think that they had 3 pretty excellent episodes to end the season. But I do have to say, I wonder if, like the royal family, The Crown will ever be the same after Diana. I feel that to a certain extent, her and Thatcher were a big draw for people this season, and it'll be interesting to see if the show can survive after her eventual departure. Obviously, she's not gone yet. We're going to get to see a little bit more. But I feel like, for all intents and purposes, the most significant drama has already passed. And I have to question, who are they going to bring in to make people excited in future seasons? Is it going to be Tony Blair? Is it going to be Hillary Clinton? I mean, who do they think the big draw is going to be going forward? And obviously, this is the last time we're going to get to see these actors in these roles, which I find a bit sad because I really do think that the cast is just uniformly excellent. And particularly, I feel that I'm going to miss Olivia Coleman. I'm sure that the subsequent actors to take on these roles are going to do a fine job, but it's just hard to switch. I felt like I wasn't even completely switched over from Claire Foy until halfway through season 4, if that tells you anything. I think it's just hard to have these changing of the guards and to view them as the same character. And to a large extent, I feel like Peter Morgan doesn't really reintroduce the characters. He just treats them as if they're the same individuals, which goes interestingly into episode 8, 48 against 1, which, in the beginning of this episode, we have a nice appearance from Claire Foy, which was pretty exciting to see. And we have a very, very interesting shot that, pans from left to right, and we continue to see kind of the reaches of the British Empire as we're doing this voiceover of Claire Foy as Elizabeth's giving this speech. And it was a nice use of the actress. It's a nice refresher that this used to be this character, although it's honestly hard for me to view Claire Foy and Olivia Coleman as playing the same person. It's just very, very different eras that they've participated in. But this episode really, really gets down to the conflict that emerged between Thatcher and the Queen over Thatcher's unwillingness to sanction South Africa and to sign this document in the Commonwealth of Nations, and how she undercut the fact that she had signed the document after the fact. And this is an interesting episode. I think clearly Peter Morgan is not on Thatcher's side, but I think that he at least allows her to defend her own positions in this episode, which I think is the fair thing to do to a large extent. I think that she comes across as very reasonable, but she also comes across as very unfeeling and not very empathetic, which is seemingly how Peter Morgan views her. Whether that's true to the real life person, we'll never know. But it's interesting to see some of her more rigid tendencies coming into play in this episode. It's, I think a lot of the time we feel that the Queen is a very inflexible person, that she is so rooted in tradition that she won't change her ways. But in this episode, we see her adapting very much. She chooses to allow her dispute with the Prime Minister to become public, despite knowing that that's a break with tradition, whereas Thatcher very much will not break from what she's decided to do. And this is one of the things that allowed Thatcher to succeed in the world of men, that she always believed that she was right and that she was so strong-willed, the Iron Lady that would never show weakness, that hated weakness. But I think that to a certain extent, it doesn't actually do her a great service in this episode, because you see that the Queen is more adaptable, that she comes across as more caring because she's willing to consider other options. And, obviously when you bring in Nelson Mandela at the end of the episode to basically say that economic sanctions were the right thing to do, you kind of feel that Peter Morgan is tipping his hand, that he very, very strongly thinks that Margaret Thatcher was just being completely unreasonable here. The episode also spent a good deal of time developing this character, Michael Shea, played by Nicholas Farrell. A familiar face, one of those people where you know the face, can't remember the name, but good character actor. And one of the things that The Crown does so well is it will introduce these characters in a way that you're interested in them, but you don't really know how they play into the story. And the way that he's introduced with him writing this novel that seemed kind of pretentious to me, it was an interesting cold open for this character, and then the eventual revelation of how he connects to the Queen and his role in this episode as he's eventually scapegoated for the leaked story that the Queen was displeased with Thatcher. It was a very interesting story, the way that things played out for his character. Very, very well portrayed. And his loyalty and unwillingness to, leak the salacious details of what's going on in this unprecedented scuffle between Downing Street and Buckingham Palace. It was really pretty interesting stuff. So I enjoyed this episode overall. I thought there was also one really funny scene at the wedding where Andrew was bemoaning the fact that his wedding, which should be the top headlines, is being distracted from by the Queen and Thatcher's fighting, and the way that Prince Charles insults him so brutally on his wedding day. It was a pretty comical scene, and I do appreciate the tonal balance of this show. It can be pretty melancholy a lot of the time, but it can also fit in these moments of humor that throw everything into relief. The last two episodes of the season, Avalanche and War, they kind of bleed together for me, in all honesty. I think that they felt kind of like a duo that go together. In this show, typically the episodes have a beginning, middle, and end structure. They feel like short stories within a larger story, but these two episodes to me felt very, very joined at the hip. And it was very, very interesting. I feel, though, that as interested as I was in Diana at the beginning of this season, at some point, things just turned into a he said, she said, tabloid row, and I found it less and less sophisticated to a certain extent. Now, I think that Emma Corrin, as I said before, deserves to be in a lot of awards conversations for her performance here. She does a really good job. I think she mimics the speech patterns of Diana brilliantly, and more than that, I think it managed to not feel like an impersonation. I think she really managed to make this role her own. And I think Josh O'Connor as Charles did a fine job, but he's been given a very, very unlikable character to play, and not since the very, very beginning of season 4 have I found him at all sympathetic. It was funny, at one point while my wife and I were watching the last episode, and Prince Charles was yelling furiously at Princess Diana after her tour of the U.S. My wife turned to me and she said, I think that Peter Morgan thinks that Prince Charles had Princess Diana murdered. And I don't think I would go so far, but you definitely see that there's not a whole lot of sympathy afforded to Prince Charles in these last episodes. Now, this could be just my viewpoint. I talked to my brother and his wife, who are also watching this show, and they thought that episode 6 actually made Princess Diana look kind of bad at times, which I found surprising because I thought it made her seem wonderful. But one thing that I took more note of as the series went on is that it seems like Princess Diana really loves to be in the spotlight, and there are things she does that kind of indicate a little bit of narcissism to me. For instance, the scene where she has recorded herself singing this song from Phantom of the Opera to watch with Prince Charles. And as much as, I don't see this as being like a hateful thing or a particularly evil thing, it definitely indicates a certain level of self-absorption, which is interesting. And you definitely see how her personality would clash with the royal family. In the scene where Prince Charles basically says, don't you think we could all do this if we wanted to? But there is this sincerity to her. There is some genuine feeling to her that you generally feel seems to be lacking in the other members of the royal family. And it certainly showed in the scenes where she visited the children at the hospital and hugged that child with AIDS. So very much, I think that this is a complicated situation. I'm not entirely sure how Peter Morgan expects us to perceive Princess Diana, but I found her, for the most part, to be sympathetic and such a sad victim of tragedy. In her own words, she blames a lot of her issues with depression and bulimia on the time that she was engaged to Prince Charles, and after they were married, that it became this really, really recurring issue for her. Now, whether that's the case or not, who can say, but that's what her story is. And it's interesting, this episode. I thought one very noteworthy scene was the scene where Camilla essentially says, and this gets back to the recurring theme of the fairy tale story that just can't be beaten, that embodies Princess Diana's story in the eyes of the public, is that she's like, I can never win. If you marry me, I will be the one who wronged Princess Diana, and no one will ever love me the way that they love her. She is the fairy tale, and I can never be that. There is an element of which Prince Charles is definitely a victim. We saw him forced to let the woman he loved marry someone else, and then marrying this woman who he really doesn't love because he thinks it's what the family wants. But I felt it was very telling. I thought that the scene where the Queen finally told Prince Charles off and said, nobody looks at you and pities you. They see a very privileged person, and nobody looks at you and pities that. And I think at times the show has tried to show how Charles would feel that he was in a difficult position. But in that particular moment, I felt like most of the people in the audience probably are just glad to see Prince Charles getting told off royally as he deserves to. I feel like there was a surprising lack of Tobias Menzies in the entire season, honestly. I expected there to be an episode focused on Prince Philip at some point, but they never really did that. He did have an interesting final scene with Princess Diana where he essentially said, you don't seem to realize that the Queen is the center of all our orbit and you want to be the center of the orbit, which gets back to the kind of narcissistic tendencies that I think that Peter Morgan has portrayed in her. I found the ending of War, the last episode of the season, to be kind of oddly muted. It didn't feel like the end of a chapter, which I feel like it should, considering that all these actors are done with these roles from here on out. You'd kind of like to have more of a farewell to them than this, but Peter Morgan has just decided to view this as all one continuous story, and that's fine. The final sound of that camera bulb flashing definitely harkens back to the earlier moment in, I believe it was the third episode, might have been the second episode, where it ends with Princess Diana walking in the fade out as a camera bulb flashes, and basically showing that her life has been defined by her relationship to the public to a large extent. Lastly, I felt like the final scene where Thatcher, and the Queen met and the Queen gave her that medal, I thought that was pretty touching. I almost teared up during the scene. I found that Thatcher was pretty cold-hearted and not treated with a lot of sympathy for a lot of this season, but you have to, I think, personally admire just the tenacity of the woman and how she got to where she got through hard work and perseverance, and how much she altered England. I think people are really oftentimes bad at nuance. We tend to view people as all good or all bad, and I think Peter Morgan, even though I don't think he really likes Thatcher that much, I think he's tried to portray a degree of nuance with her. I think he's tried to show her as a complete and whole person. And, when you look at her legacy, I think that it has a complicated legacy. But I liked this final speech from the Queen to her where she said, we have as much in common, that we could talk about, and people just always seem to focus on our differences. And I think that's, something I think that all of us tend to do. We tend to focus on the differences that we have in others instead of on what should unite us in our common humanity. I really, really enjoyed this season. I think that it'll be interesting to see if the show maintains people's interest from this point on without Princess Diana, without Margaret Thatcher, without some of these more familiar faces from history. But I think that this season was pretty much a home run. I think it's probably the best season of The Crown in my estimation. Definitely had some very, very remarkable performances, some very, very remarkable writing, and just excellent top-notch production values and directing overall. But let me know what you thought in the comments. Sorry it's taken me so long to get all these reviews out. It didn't want to binge this show, but I ended up watching more episodes in one sitting than I really meant to, nonetheless. So if you're interested in seeing my other reviews of other upcoming shows and movies, please consider subscribing to the channel. And as always, thanks for watching.